Good evening and welcome. Here we are. History is being made. This is the first time that Pray Tell blog has broadcast live from anywhere. And in fact, we're broadcasting tonight from the National Convention of the National Association of Pastoral Musicians, NPM, the largest organization we have in the United States Catholic Church for pastoral musicians. And here we are in Washington, D.C. We're in the exhibition hall. It's opening night of this year's National Convention. The theme here is Vatican II because it's the 50-year anniversary of the Great Reformist Council. The exhibition hall here is opening. We have all sorts of exhibitioners here. NPM is huge. An NPM National Convention has a lot of buzz and a lot of excitement. And Liturgical Press is here. Liturgical Press is a co-sponsor of Pray Tell blog, along with St. John's School of Theology as a part of St. John's University back in Collegeville. We have a great panel of 5 distinguished guests with us tonight. I'd like to introduce each of them briefly. Pedro Rubalcava is here. He works with another publishing house. I always forget the name. No, I'm teasing you.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm teasing you. He's with Oregon Catholic Press, that great organization, OCP. Pedro is a specialist in Hispanic liturgical music, but not only. Pedro also does a lot of work in catechetics and youth ministry and RCIA. And his music collection, Amanecer, was nominated for a Grammy Award. And Pedro and his wife and his 2 children live in Oregon. Good to have you here,
It's good to be
Pedro. My brother monk, Father Peter Funk. Peter and I are both up way past our bedtime, so our dedication to this cause is just huge. It's great to have Peter here. Peter's a fellow co-conspirator in the Great Gregorian Chant cause. He studied with me at St. John several years ago. Father Peter is the prior of the Community of the Holy Cross, a small but growing community with a real traditional observance in Hyde Park in Chicago. And Peter has studied music composition, and he composes himself, and he has founded an ensemble that sings polyphony of the 15th to 17th century at Holy Cross Abbey in Hyde Park. Audrey Seah is with us. Audrey was baptized a Catholic about 9 years ago. Audrey has been a student at St. John's University. She got her master's degree in liturgy and then is now working on a 2nd degree in theology. Audrey is a composer, and she has also studied Gregorian chant with me and directed the National Catholic Youth Choir this summer in the Gregorian chant that they did. And Audrey is also a student of all areas of theology, but especially liturgy and multicultural and issues of systematic theology. So it's great to have Audrey here. And I should say, Audrey is here on short notice, filling in because Sister Kathleen Harmon was not able to make it. She was scheduled to be with us, but Sister Kathleen's father passed away. So we're remembering in prayer Mr. John Harmon and Kathleen and the entire family. So Audrey, thanks for joining us. Joel Balistreri comes to us from the Archdiocese of Detroit, where he is Archdiocesan Director of Music and co-director at Blessed Sacrament Cathedral. And Joe has a bachelor's and a master's degree in organ from the University of Michigan. So we have a great diverse group of people who are going to start arguing. Is that it? No, we're going to discuss. We're going to dialogue about church music. So here we are in the midst of a lot of church music. National Pastoral Musicians, there's some 2,800 people here all week for the convention. And a lot of them are right here tonight checking out the wares. I'm thinking of the money changers in the temple, but money is a part of the whole thing. There is a cash bar going on. There's refreshments. The whole atmosphere is pretty exciting. I'm going to have to stay up more often past 8:30. There's more going on than I realize this time of the day. Well, anyway, I'm doing all the talking. I want to stop now, and I want to we'll go around the circle, and I'd like to ask each of our friends, what do you think the influences are that are really influencing church music in this country? What do you think the movers are, a person or a place or a thing? From your perspective, what do you see going on?
Well, I guess I would start out by saying things that I see kind of coming down the pipe as sort of future influences and things that are really growing. Number one is sort of a postmodern approach to liturgical music. At least, especially in the younger generations, I see such an interest in all kinds of music done well. It can be Gregorian chant, it can be music written by a music director in a parish, the best of the St. Louis Jesuits, good music from all types of genres, from all different cultures. There's such an interest in that right now. But the number two thing I would say that really comes from sort of the YouTube generation and the idea of things going viral is the idea of authenticity. That really, when you look at something that goes viral on YouTube, it's something that happened in someone's real life, or it was a flash mob. It's something that the core of it is some intrinsic, wonderful good, but it's something happening in the real world. It's real life. It's something we can connect to that's authentic and comes from a real sentiment. So I think in liturgical music, you see young people really searching for that. There's a strong interest in that. So those are my two movers, I'd say.
This is excellent, and young people seem to keep getting younger, or else I'm getting older. What strikes me, and you and I have talked a little bit about this, postmodern means everything is kind of radically decentered and diverse, and I see people of your generation mixing and matching in ways that I didn't think you could do that you can be left wing on this social justice issue, but like the Tridentine Mass, just to name one, sort of example that I would not have expected. So we can play with your thoughts later.
I have a couple of thoughts actually coming off what Joe just said too. I think part of the internet is how global it can be. Globalization, the fact that so many cultures are interacting with each other. We have that mix, so someone who likes Gregorian chant could like it even if they're in, say, Asia, and be exposed to that. While so many people, say, in European countries now are getting more and more comfortable with trying to do, African American music, for example, and just playing around with the diversity and still finding that is really what makes Catholicism Catholic in many ways. The power of the internet, just being able to find anything at your fingertips, I think is the second thing. And how we use the internet as pastoral musicians, I think will really affect the way the future of Catholic music. Church Music Association of America, for example, uses it really well. I mean, they have wonderful chant resources on their website. People are able to look for it. I think the open source thing is also a big thing. Having people be able to get these music anytime they want to will make a big difference. And the amount of music we put out there, the genres we put out there that we make available for people will also, I think, make a path, or that will affect how we eventually get to the future, or who knows what will become of it, because you don't know what goes on the internet.
Thanks, Audrey. Father Peter?
Well, I'll put my own plug in for the internet with the perspective that it allows a certain decentralization of planning so that local churches can really capitalize on their needs rather than the more typical top-down approach that we've had, either coming from the Holy See or from big publishing companies. The internet makes possible all kinds of resources that we wouldn't otherwise have. I think also the writings of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, particularly as Cardinal Ratzinger, his writings on the liturgy are starting to filter down into the consciousness of people who are doing the planning, especially the idea of continuity with the tradition. And the final thing I wanted to throw out there, which I don't want to oversell this, but there's a certain tension between the Catholic Church and the overall culture today. I don't think that's going away. It might even become more tense, and I think this means that as Catholics, this will be an impetus to come together and work together across different felt divisions within the Church today.
One of the things I think, not just the internet, but I think social media has had or is having a great impact on how music is disseminated, how people experience music for worship and liturgical music. I think one of the big difference makers is going to be, certainly in the U.S., is the Hispanic communities and any other number of church communities that are immigrant communities, whether they're from Asia or from Africa, and the influence that the Southern Hemisphere particularly has on the Roman Catholic Church. And one of the big things that I've seen, and it's been coming since I remember the 70s when I was a young man, is the influence that the charismatic renewal has on liturgy and music, and the impact that, or how little impact the church, the official church in the U.S. has on these growing communities because of a lack of ways of communicating. And for the most part, the attention is not paid there. The attention is paid on the English speaking, and all these other folks are under the radar, and they get away with, I'll use the word get away, but with doing things that isn't at the forefront. And I think that's a big thing to keep
In terms of paraphrasing official texts, replacing things out, switching them out, omitting, adding?
That's some of it, but certainly genres of music that are, people say, they even have a label for it's charismatic music, or it's, in English-speaking terms, it's CCM, or it's things they're more contemporary speaking. And even coming from the sense of a Catholic publisher, we publish a very popular Spanish hymnal, and yet I find that there's still a lot of people either don't know what it is or don't use it because they bring musics from other places, from their home, country, etc.
So there's a lot going on out there. I'm struck by how disparate these different forces are that you people mentioned. So how would you sort of put all of this together and make some comparisons? Of the various things mentioned, is there any consensus about what are the big ones and what are not so big? I mean, there's a growing interest in chant and the Tridentine Mass, but is that pretty tiny compared to the huge influence of the Hispanic community, or is the big influence more what's happening with internet, or what's your sense of what are the bigger and the lesser movers out there?
Well, since I have the mic, I'll go ahead and say, I think it's all. For instance, you take it into the context who comes to the MPM, and I think one of the things I was reading recently, I think they give out these numbers about who attends, the MPM, or who is members of the MPM, and I think something like 12% of the people that attend here have a Spanish Mass or other language Mass in their parishes. So right away, that's saying it's not the face of what the church is in the U.S. And so we have to pay attention to that.
Well, I'm not sure I'm in a real good position to say what the large trends are. We have a pretty particular focus. I think it would be wonderful if there were more chant. Again, I would say one of the things that makes possible a real creative engagement with the present is a real rootedness in the tradition, because it's through the church that we receive the revelation, that we celebrate, that we're a part of it, the liturgy. But I'd be interested to hear from the younger persons here.
I'm really struck by what Pedro was saying about we live in such a pluralistic society here, and since the liturgical changes and the reform in the 60s, we really have almost grown in so many different directions. I would totally agree with Pedro that I think NPM as an organization and other organizations really need to reach out more to the Hispanic community, especially because from experience in the diocese, I know when the Hispanic community comes to the cathedral and we have diocesan celebrations for Juan Diego and Guadalupe, musically, it's amazing to see these photocopied pieces that come from local composers and all kinds of wild sources that you wouldn't expect. Where sort of in the Anglo community, it's much more strict, and the bishop's here, so we have to, sit up straight and follow the rules. But at the same time, I noticed what really struck me today was when the young people were asked to stand up, everyone under 30. And I was shocked at how few young people are here. And I attended the Church Music Association of America's thing in DC, the colloquium, Salt Lake City. And I mean, there were more young people at that than there are here at a more mainstream organization. And I guess my concern would be, are we going to grow apart? Are we going separate ways without really looking at who we are as church and who we are in a broader sense? And how can we really come together? And I mean, maybe the internet, maybe social media is a big part of that. So we're all at least aware of what different Catholic communities are doing. I think it's a tricky question.
It's a very tricky question. I'll be very blunt. I know of a certain pope who is blunt sometimes in what he says, so I'll pick up the lead from Francis, Bishop of Rome. The reputation of NPM, let's be honest, is, well, they're old and they're liberal. Now, that's not quite fair. Obviously, it's a very diverse group, and NPM does everything from organ music to Hispanic music to contemporary to bongo drums to Latin chant and everything in between. It's very diverse, and we do have lots of different age groups, but we do have more old people than young people. And it may seem like an organization like this was more influential 20 or 30 years ago than now, and it may seem like some of the energy is passing elsewhere. Do you have that sense? And what do you make of that?
I'll go. I think what's common that we have really here, it sounds like, is diversity, and in a sense that's the postmodern reality. We have these different strains going off. We have a huge interest in the Tridentine Rite, again, that's sort of growing, but we also have an interest in multicultural liturgies and all that, the interest in coming back to tradition. So a lot of people are getting drawn to Gregorian chant, but I don't think any of these are incompatible. But the fact that the world has opened up and we're now seeing more possibilities, I think for young people especially who don't have, for lack of a better word, baggage that the older generation may have, they're just looking for something they can find God in, something sometimes novel. Oftentimes, I know a lot of friends who move from a preference to another as they grow older, and they change their prayer style, so on and so forth. But they get something out of it. So they may start in the charismatic movement. As they grow older, they become a little bit more contemplative, so on and so forth. But when they start recognizing how the different, say, genres of music or different types of worship has actually shaped their spirituality, then they sort of are able to find God in all things, and through the different types of worship that's available to us. And I think that's something we never had in the past because, transportation, the world was just, we didn't have the internet. Yeah.
I perhaps should clarify something I mean about tradition, because it's apt to be heard in a certain sort of fixed way. And one of the things I think is really important to understand is that the tradition is extremely broad. And so if we think of tradition as sort of what existed from 1900 to 1950, in the United States, I think that's what people think. I'm thinking about a tradition that goes back to the apostolic times, with lots of diversity in it, but with certain commonalities and influences back and forth between, say, monasteries at different parts of Europe, the influence of Greece and Constantinople and so on. So the multiculturalism is, that we're also talking about is not something that should be opposed to appropriating tradition. Tradition should give us models for ways of working together. And I would also just say with the young people, an interesting challenge is sometimes the interest in chant can be a mixture of something sort of ironic, it's just because it's old and in a different language, and also just sort of an aesthetic choice. And I think another thing that's important, when I mentioned Pope Emeritus Benedict, his writings on the liturgy, of learning to understand what's actually going on in the liturgy, making it authentically who we are, I think it will make all of these jobs more possible and make it easier.
I was thinking that as I listened to everyone here, that one of the things that I would say is that I hope I'm not coming across as saying that people in all these other immigrant communities don't appreciate chant or don't appreciate, other more classical types of music. I don't think that's the case. I think the case is that people have yet to experience or have very few opportunities to experience it done well. And so when I've taught young Hispanic people to sing chant, it's a wonderful thing. And I've been to communities where they actually use that. The pastor brings it across. But part of the challenge is how we bring formation, liturgical formation, and musical formation to a lot of these immigrant communities that's not a part of regular church life or even school life for folks. There's in some sense it's only relegated to the folks that go to Catholic school, the folks that go to seminary, etc., religious schools. So one of the challenges I think is to just as other folks were saying, is how do you create an environment in which people are exposed to music that leads them into prayer? And for me, it's a search for deepening spirituality more than the music. And so you mentioned about the charismatics going into a more contemplative style. That's what happened to me. At 17 years old, I was very involved in charismatic renewal, and that led me to seek contemplation. And I think if people have this experience of deepening faith, then the music or the expression of culture through ways that are popular expressions, whether it's something they do in the home, that is nurtured. And if you include the music that allows them to express their faith, then that grows and that deepens. So I think a challenge for us as church is to really pay attention to those things and say, how do we give people an experience, a broader and a deeper experience of what music as prayer can be?
I want to switch topics a little bit and move toward the future. I'd like to ask you, what would be your wish list for the future? What are your hopes of what you would like to see happen or what you think could happen? In terms of the things you've talked about that seem important to you, what would you hope that NPM and what would you hope that the U.S. Catholic Church can work on in the next 5 to 10 years?
Again, I'll start because I have the microphone. I guess my hopes would be, as I mentioned, a more creative engagement with the tradition so as to make possible real local expressions of the faith, that individual dioceses, even individual groups of parishes would have some kind of common musical, liturgical identity. I don't know if we can do that in 10 years, but there's always hope, as long as... the other thing is that we would really understand more profoundly that the liturgy at root is not something we do. It's an expression of the high priesthood of Christ. And so we cooperate in that. We can have confidence that way in trying new things, but also we can have greater confidence if we're aware of how these expressions have been, how the church has mediated this expression of Christ's priesthood in the past.
Peter, can I ask you something?
Yes, you may.
As I hear you talking a bit more than the rest of us about tradition and engaging the teachings of Pope Emeritus Benedict and talking about the challenges of the culture is changing pretty fast. Secularization is advancing. A lot of young people are nuns. Note the spelling of that. N-O-N-E-S. They're growing rapidly. And I know this because you and I have talked a little bit about this, that I'm hearing some overtones of a more, Balthasarian, theology from above. I'm sure it's more nuanced to that, and I don't mean to put you in a box, but with someone of the sentiments that you're talking about, doesn't it look kind of bleak when you look out at this secular culture? Are you hopeful with your basic worldview?
As long as what I say about the liturgy is true, if God is there, there's always hope. We have nothing to be afraid of. And I think that's why for me it's the key, because if what we're doing is participating in God's life, somehow or other that's going to communicate itself, and it's going to make us joyful persons who are going to evangelize. And that sounds perhaps overly pious, but it's my real conviction.
And it's said with a smile. I like that. Good.
If I might jump on something that you said, Anthony, the idea of culture and the idea of culture is changing so rapidly, and what is American culture and what is Catholic culture? I feel like really, at least for me, this is just speaking somewhat personally, I'd love to see in the future more of an identity, a development of a Catholic cultural identity through some of our more sensory experiences, whether that's a musical experience or more of a universality in architecture, something that allows us, when we go to church and spend time with our community, to identify not just as Americans in our cultural context, but to identify as something beyond ourselves, as something more universal. I feel like
so we need more. I'm going to play devil's advocate here. So we need more of our rich Catholic tradition and more of this universal heritage that was created by these dead white European males, mostly ordained, and under the patronage of a stratified society, and the aristocratic class supported it. We need more of that.
I'm going to draw an analogy because I have my degrees in music, I'm going to draw an analogy on this. I see exactly where you're going. But think of the second Viennese school. So the first Viennese school would have been the Baroque music, and it was sort of this development of the doctrine of the affections and a universal sort of structure in musical language that different affective gestures like yadun, yadun means weeping, and an ascending fifth means rejoicing or a trumpet or something. In the second Viennese school with a composer like Schoenberg and the other serialists, they said, no, we're breaking with the past, and we're going to start from scratch and start a new culture. And really, I think there's been sort of a rejection of the second Viennese school in music. And in a sense, I mean, I know I'm talking to a liturgical blog here, pray tell, so here we go. I hope I don't crucify myself. But I feel like there's a sense in some liturgical circles that, in 1969 with the Novus Ordo, we had to split with the old and start with a new here and now cultural context. You look at some architecture, some brutalist church architecture from the 70s and 80s. I mean, you can't identify some buildings as Catholic churches. But I think...
How dare the Holy Spirit do all that?
Well, exactly, how dare the Holy Spirit. But the key, I think, I'd love to see growth out of tradition. And that includes everything that's happened since the council. But, that's something that's, like Father was saying, Father Peter, something more inclusive of the past, that has that identity, yet grows in this sort of worldwide church that we really live in now, that expresses all of our different cultures. I'd love to see something a little more postmodern, to, go on another theme I had earlier.
Wonderful.
I just want to add to what you've spoken about tradition. I am all for tradition. I love chants and everything else, but I would contest that I think what we think as tradition is lacking because of what has opened up in the world today, there's so many traditions in cultures that we have never encountered before that we need to bring into the church. And I think that is where true tradition comes from. And that's where we get the diversity before, things that happened with the Galligans and all that. Before all that broke up and we saw tradition as something that was more unified. So that would be where I think the pluses of being in a postmodern world is there's so much more richness we have never ever thought was possible that is now available to us. I think where we are now is sort of this question, what do we do with all that? There's more than we can handle, I think. So when we have that problem, then we're like, all right, let's just go back to what we know. That could be good sometimes, but we need to see where the Spirit is moving as well, I think.
It seems to be that perhaps a question to be asked it goes something to what you were saying, Anthony, is that, is it just about the white European male dominant things? And I think that's where we tend to get stuck sometimes. And I agree that there are many things yet to discover. I mean, you look at some of the traditions that developed into the newly Christianized, historically churches, Latin America, Africa, Asia, etc. And the intercultural experiences that came out of those areas. And so what makes that any less tradition than what, folks might experience as tradition? So I think tradition, and I like what you were saying, it's not just the 1900s to the 1950s in the U.S. It's broader than that. I'm part of a team that the U.S. bishops put together through the Cultural Diversity Office, and they have a program for formation. It's called Building Intercultural Competencies for Ministry. And interesting, you bring all these folks together, and one of the overarching questions that always exists, well, how do we worship together? And it goes beyond language, but sometimes we get stuck at language. How do we express this unity with Christ's ministry? How do we express that? How do we, in the various forms that folks bring from their individual cultural expressions? And I think that, for me, is the big question. I don't know how many of you saw any of the liturgies from the World Youth Day in Brazil, but I mean, they were singing Latin, but it certainly wasn't Gregorian chant. So some people get say, oh, it's Latin. Okay, well, we'll just put a pop, melody and tune, and there we go. Maybe somebody will be happy about that. But it goes beyond that. I mean, I think it's a bigger question, and I think we need to. The future, for me at least, I'm hopeful that we'll ask those questions and we'll answer them. And first and foremost is, how do we live together? How do we be together so that we can worship together?
Well, thank you, Pedro, and thank you to everyone. Did you have something you wanted to add? Go for it.
Well, I was anticipating your devil's advocate response.
Oh, good.
Yeah, because yes, all that's true in some sense. I think a hermeneutic of continuity. Part of what that is again, the broad church includes the communion of the saints. We have to love our forebears in the faith, whatever their cultural context was, and try to understand it from their perspective. Again, we can be just as culturally sort of deaf to the Middle Ages as we can to contemporary cultures that aren't our own. And so to appreciate them, not necessarily to make their failings ours, but to be able to build on some of the things we've had in modern times. And anyway, I just wanted to throw that out. I think it's important to approach with benefit of the doubt with our fellow Catholics.
Yeah, wonderful. We've opened up so many questions tonight. I can tell we could easily talk until midnight. Yeah, isn't it great? Isn't it great fun to play with all of this stuff? We've reached the end of our time, but this is only the beginning of Pray Tell's presence at NPM here in DC this year. So check out the schedule online. Rita Ferrone will be hosting some sessions. I'll be hosting another group on Wednesday, and we'll be talking about Pope Francis. I also want to say that this afternoon we did a live broadcast of the opening session of NPM. That will be archived and it will be going up at Pray Tell, and I can't recommend it highly enough. Rita Ferrone gave just a dynamite opening address, but the entire opening ceremony, it's such an image of NPM in its diversity and in its contemporaneity. So it gives a real image into where this large church music organization is at. So I welcome all of your comments at the blog. Everyone be nice. We sometimes have a food fight in the comm box, and I have to deal with that. But hey, come on in. We enjoy the conversation. Thanks again. Thanks to Pedro, Father Peter, Audrey, and Joel. Until